them dead. Pumatay kayo. Shoot 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 them dead. You are free to kill the idiots. There is 3 million, there's a 3 million drug addict. I'd be happy to slaughter them.
Kasinungalingan yung sinasabi ng militar na wala silang kinalaman.
Bakit yung pinalaman? Mawalang iya kayo!
It will be all too easy to muddle the truth, make it all the more harder to find out who or what is killing journalists, because the entire political landscape is so toxic.
The words that can describe the president, I think it's the words mass murder.
On March 7, a series of operations conducted by state forces resulted in the deaths of 9 activists in several cities.
Wala kang kasalanan, wala kang kasalanan, inosente ka.
Paulit-ulit na pinapaalala natin sa AFP, sa PNP, sa NTF-ELCA, na ginagarantiyahan ng salitang dapat sa karapatan ng bawat tao na magpahayag. Mr. Chair, Senate President, sa lahat ng narito, kailangan may managot.
Bonjour, bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is the Reverend Patricia Lisson, and I'm a member of the core working group of Investigateph. I especially would like to welcome the journalists and media workers who are here. I welcome members of the state delegation to Geneva and any special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council. I give a particularly special welcome to all Filipino people in attendance since this independent international commission of investigation was launched in response to Filipino calls for help in the face of the terrible violations of their human rights. The third report of Investigateph is launched today on the opening of the 48th regular session of the UN Human Rights Council. High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet will be giving a verbal report on the Philippines on Thursday, October the 7th. This third report examines the violation of the collective human rights to development, self-determination, and peace in the Philippines, and how these infractions are imposed by state transgressions of civil and political rights amid the harsh impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The initial report, released on March 2021, documented intensifying political repressions since the statement of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in June 2020. This initial report demonstrated the human rights violation in the Philippines had actually intensified since her report, and it raised the alarm at the failure of the domestic remedies to address these human rights violations. The second report developed this picture to show that what prevails in the Philippines is state terror, war on poor people in the guise of anti-drug operations, a war on dissent in guise of a war on communism, a war on the Moro people in guise of a war on terror. As well as reporting more violations of civil and political rights, it showed how the Duterte government was breaching international humanitarian law by failing to discriminate between civilians and combatants in the conduct of military operations. Just prior to the second report, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court recommended to its pre-trial chamber that an investigation of the crimes against humanity of murder and other crimes commence against officials of the Duterte government. As well, the Supreme Court of the Philippines took some action to rein in abuses of judicial processes uncovered in our initial report. We are encouraged by these developments, and we know they have given many Filipino people hope that they may see justice. We urge the international community to increase the pressure on the Philippine government to correct the serious abuses we and others have been exposing. Today, our panel of 4 commissioners will present the aspects of the third and final report to you. Each of them will speak for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we will have question and answer period with the media workers. And for the question and answer part, I invite people to use the Q&A, the media. On our panel this afternoon, we have the Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow. She is the General Secretary of the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church in the US. Attorney Jeannie Meyer, President of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers and a co-chair for the National Lawyers Guild International. The Reverend Derek Duncan, Executive, East Asia and the Pacific Office, Global Ministries of the United Church of Christ in the US. Attorney Susan Adderley, co-chair of the International Committee of the National Lawyers Guild. So I welcome you all this afternoon and particularly thank our presenters for their time and energy for this presentation. I turn the screen to the Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow.
Thank you so much. Today, I want to speak to you about the rights of children, the right to education, and freedom of religion, which have all been attacked by the Duterte government. Duterte's budgets boost spending on the security forces and cut spending on welfare, housing, education, and health. This has really hurt the people, and especially during the pandemic. Duterte has new machinery for repression, which we have seen time and again. The 2020 Anti-Terrorism Act, the National Task Force to End Local Communism Armed Conflict, orchestrate attacks on church people, indigenous communities, teachers and students, and children. As it relates to children and youth, we have seen stories of over 122 children that have been killed in the war on drugs up to 2019. It will be even higher now. Only the killing of 17-year-old Kian de los Santos resulted in the conviction of the police. Moves to lower the age of minimum criminal responsibility from 15 to 12 means children are being arrested and detained with adult prisoners. Children have become victims of militarized pandemic lockdowns. And children have become victims of the state's counterinsurgency operations. One young woman, 15-year-old Fabielle Pinada, who violated a quarantine curfew, was sexually assaulted by the police. When she filed rape charges, she was gunned down. Children were locked in coffins and dog cages for allegedly violating quarantine. I now turn to the violations of religious freedom, which we have seen. Religious leaders and church workers are being red tagged and hit with trumped up charges. Police arrested Sister Elena Belardo, a religious of the Good Shepherd, a nun, and the former national coordinator of rural missionaries of the Philippines. In addition, bank accounts have freeze orders that were allegedly financing terrorism, and a violation of religious freedoms of Islamic Moro people due to the Marawi siege and ongoing military operations of displacement in Mindanao. Also, violations of the rights of indigenous peoples has been vivid. Big corporations are grabbing the lands of indigenous people and displacing their communities. President Duterte has specifically ordered attacks on Lamad communities and has closed 215 Lamad schools, affecting the education of over 10,000 students. This is of particular concern to United Methodists, as we have many churches in that area. 7 Lamads who were staying at the University of San Carlos after being displaced from their communities were arrested by the police and falsely accused of training Lamad students to be child rebels. That was on February the 15th, 2021. Farmers have also been accused of being NPA members after fleeing a military bombardment of their community. In conclusion, President Duterte's whole of nation strategy against critics in the name of stopping communist armed conflict has involved attacks on the educational system and teachers, evident in the ongoing closure of Lamad schools, including occupation of schools, arrest of children, and attacks on teachers and universities by state authorities. Churches and religious leaders and individuals have been directly attacked because they advocate for the urban poor, rural poor, and indigenous people's rights. Thank you very much.
Oh, Patricia, you need to unmute your mic.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Susan. I knew that was going to happen. I invite Jeannie Mayer to share her reflection on the economic rights. Jeannie, you're also muted.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm going to speak about the issue of violations of economic, social, and cultural rights, or mainly economic rights. I want to start by mentioning the key international human rights instruments which are applicable to these rights and how they should be upheld and followed rather than being violated with impunity by the Duterte regime, despite the Philippine government ratifying the instruments and thereby including them in Philippine law. The first instrument is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in 1948 and ratified by all countries. It recognized the intertwined or the inextricable link between economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights. Some of the economic rights enshrined in the Declaration include the right to work at a job with remuneration adequate for the dignity to support human life and support a life of dignity. The right to a standard of living adequate to support people and their families, the right to health and well-being of each person, including the right to food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services. It is in fact, the way in which countries uphold these rights and the governments do that is how they really should be judged by the international community. Civil and political rights, as we've said in our previous reports, are really the necessary engines through which people can achieve the rights through which they can achieve these other rights to preserve human dignity. As noted, the Philippine government has ratified both the treaties developed to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And we will be dealing with that in my presentation. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights elaborates mostly the economic rights and as all of these rights of the peoples in states that have ratified them. This treaty requires a state to use and to devote the maximum available of its resources to progressively realize the rights in the covenant. Progressive realization of these economic rights means that there will be continual progress to reach these rights, and that states should take all steps to implement them. In many cases, economic rights are violated not because the resources are not available, but they have been misallocated. And also included in the concept of progressive realization is the illegality of governments taking step backwards in the realization of these rights. The Commission found that the Duterte government has not devoted maximum available resources to realizing these rights and has illegally regressed. As applied to the Philippines, the Commission found in its third report that the Duterte government's extreme neoliberal economic policies violate the rights contained in the economic rights instrument, including the right to a job and livelihoods of peasants, workers, migrant workers, and women. Land reform, which is aimed at providing livelihood to these workers, has stalled. Real wages have fallen. Labor export continues due to lack of jobs in the domestic economy. Demolitions of urban poor communities are accelerating. Inequality is deepening. At least 50% of Filipinos live in poverty. Rather than devoting maximum resources to achieving basic economic rights, the Duterte government is putting more and more resources into military rather than public health response to COVID-19 pandemic. And this has only exacerbated these severe economic hardships. Despite economic hardships during the pandemic, Duterte has violated the rule of non-regression by cutting social service spending in favor of increased spending on armed security forces, prioritizing intensified state terror, extrajudicial killings, and mass arrests. The Philippine relief package in the pandemic is the lowest in all of Asia. Similarly, the regime has increased and institutionalized the power of security forces through the National Task Force on the Elimination of the Communist activities, and the Anti-Terrorism Act, which meets demands for economic rights by trade unions, peasants, and migrant organizations with repression. The Joint Industrial Peace Concerns Office now orchestrates repression of trade unions in export processing zones and special economic zones. Many of the key concerns of the commissioners, based on the evidence presented, including farmers continuing to experience land grabbing, land use conversion, forced eviction, and demolition of their farms. The Duterte government has directly attacked workers and farmers. The KMP has documented 340 victims of extrajudicial killings among peasants during the Duterte presidents, while the KMU has documented 56 among its workers. Veteran trade unionist leader Manny Asuncion was among those slain in the bloody massacre of March 7th, 2021. The Joint Industrial Peace Concerns Office interferes with workers exercising, holding union elections, and organizing certification. The NTF ELCAC demands that unions disaffiliate from the KMU Labor Center. Police say that JIPCO will allow them to prevent industries from being infiltrated by communist agitators. Overseas Filipino workers have also been failed by the government. The government has failed to provide immediate, organized, and safe repatriation to hundreds of thousands of overseas Filipino workers during the pandemic. This government left thousands stranded at sea in their host countries without enough food and water, medical assistance, financial assistance, and adequate shelters. The National Task Force pushed for the appointment of military attachés in Philippines embassies in countries with significant overseas Filipino worker population, and then held seminars to red tag Migrante International and other progressive organizations that fight for the rights of migrants and the Filipino people. Women have also been persecuted. Duterte has persecuted women who criticize his policies. Vice President Lenny Robredo, Senator Leila de Lima, women journalists, and Maria Ressa deposed Chief Justice Sereno, missionary sister Patricia Fox, and women peasant leaders. Soldiers killed and desecrated the bodies of 2 Limad women hemp farmers in Surigao del Sur, and one of them only 12 years old. The Duterte government has red tagged and branded as terrorists women's organization Gabriela and its members. Security forces surveil, harass, arrest, many on trumped up charges, and some are killed. Gabriela Women's Party List, the sole women's sectoral party in the Philippine Congress for 17 years, now faces disqualification for the 2022 congressional elections. In conclusion, there has been a total failure of domestic remedies to address the ongoing human rights violations and humanitarian crisis caused by the state terror. Our report concludes that human rights violations in the Philippines have intensified since the release of the June 2020 Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeannie. Now I turn it over to Derek Duncan to share his reflection on the right to development and peace.
Thank you very much. In this piece, I will elaborate on the right to development and peace, and some of the key themes that were lifted up repeatedly through the interviews we conducted and reflected in this report. An overarching theme is the conviction of multiple subjects that the Philippines remains subservient to US interests in economic, military, and geopolitical policy, and that this continually undermines the people's right to self-determination, development, and peace, provoking protest and repression. A through-line analysis is that one of the main causes of so much social damage is the priority of Duterte's administration to conform Filipino economic policies to a neoliberal US-led global economic agenda. Moreover, there's a clear perception that US President Trump urged Duterte to terminate the peace talks with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines in 2017. This meant a cessation of the process to achieve genuine land reform and national industrial development as laid out in the draft comprehensive agreement on social and economic reforms with the NDFP. Other key observations noted in the report include the problematic effect of immense US military aid that is given to the Philippine security forces, with little concern for the violence and violations of international humanitarian law committed by forces against civilians. We note that the US has committed over $300 million in military aid to support Duterte's counterinsurgency operations in Mindanao since 2017, and has donated over $765 million in planes, ships, and other military equipment to the Philippine government since 2015. Specific infractions include the incident of soldiers treating the body of slain NPA medic Javelin Colomat in Mindanao as a war trophy, the fact that 7 unarmed NDFP peace consultants have been extrajudicially executed since the peace talks were canceled in November of 2017. That military operations against Moro indigenous communities in particular, such as in the 2017 Marawi siege, are conducted in a manner that fails to adequately discriminate between civilians and combatants. That despite several severe economic hardship during the pandemic, that Duterte has cut social services while increasing spending on armed security forces, thereby prioritizing anti-terror actions, extrajudicial killings, and mass arrests. A key concern regards Duterte's whole-of-nation approach to counterinsurgency. We contend that the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict uses local and national institutions to attack human rights defenders, people's organizations, and civil society through mass arrests and detention on trumped-up charges, red tagging, and state-perpetuated killings. Finally, we're concerned that the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 has become a main instrument in Duterte's counterinsurgency program, but is mainly used to vilify activists and their organizations and to criminalize dissent. In conclusion, rather than improving the condition for Filipinos people, the Philippines' historic capitulation to US interests, its poverty, landlessness, exploitation, repression, and rebellion have all exacerbated by the anti-people policies of the Duterte government since it came to power in July 2016. Landlessness, unemployment, and poverty have widened, and extrajudicial killings of civilians by state forces in these 5.5 years have long surpassed those during the 16 years of the Marcos dictatorship. Women, children, and indigenous people have especially suffered. People's collective rights to self-determination, development, and peace are violated. These fundamental rights of the Filipino people to determine their own future free of foreign domination, to improve the living standards of all its people, and to live in peace are being grossly violated by the Duterte government and abetted by foreign powers who continue to arm him without holding him accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, for your report and to review from the third report. Just to remind our media folk, if you have questions, please put them in our Q&A, because following our last speaker, Suzanne Adley, we will address your questions. It would be helpful to have them there. Thank you very much. Now I turn it over to Susan Adley.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to all of my colleagues who spoke prior. I'm going to summarize some of the findings of this third report and the commission overall, and point out some of the key recommendations that have been included. The Commission of Inquiry has uncovered extensive evidence of crimes against humanity in the Duterte government's three-pronged war, the so-called war on drugs, essentially a war on the poor, the war on the Moro people, and the war on dissent. We, the commissioners and subcommissioners and the public have heard through the Investigateph, have heard and received horrifying testimonies of violations, not just of civil and political rights, but violations of almost every UN and international instrument designed to protect people, be they women, children, indigenous communities, workers, farmers, teachers, peace advocates, and human rights defenders. The international community must review the evidence uncovered by Investigateph and take action to hold this brutal regime to account. Investigateph and its commissioners have made a number of recommendations both to the government of the Philippines and to the international community. You can read those recommendations in our report, but I would like to just highlight a few. To the International Criminal Court, the ICC must expedite the recommendation of former ICC prosecutor Bensouda to investigate the crime against humanity of murder in the context of the Philippines' war on drugs campaign and alleged allegations of torture and other inhumane acts and related events. To the UN Human Rights Council, you must authorize an independent investigation of human rights violations in the Philippines since the June 4th, 2020 report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and hold the government of the Republic of the Philippines and its officials accountable for the thousands of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law carried out as official state policy, and convey all three Investigateph reports to the Working Group on Communications to assess all of the violations of human rights alleged in them. To the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, investigate the Philippine government for, as my colleague Derek just spoke about, for its subservience to the US in economic military policies and its failure to provide the majority of its budget resources to progressively improve the living standards of the Filipino people. To the UN Human Rights Committee on Enforced Disappearances and the Committee Against Torture, investigate President Rodrigo Duterte for the execution of Memorandum Order 32 and Executive Order 70. These official orders have reinforced by its public statements to kill drug users and dissenters, have allowed state security agencies and other civilian government agencies to utilize government funds and networks to weaponize the law, stifle dissent, and wrongly jail targeted individuals, torture, abduct, and kill them. To the ILO, the International Labor Organization, expedite the ILO high-level tripartite mission to the Philippines on the application of standards of freedom of association and protection of the right to organize through a physical visit by the mission to the Philippines. And to the US Congress, speaking as a US citizen, it's time to pass the Philippines Human Rights Act to halt the US government's Philippine military funding assistance, including weapons and sales and donations of armaments, until the government of the Philippines can guarantee the human rights of its citizens and establish a fair judicial system to gain accountability for victims of human rights. And in that same vein, we call upon all states who have cooperation agreements for military and police training and arms and equipment sales with the Philippines to suspend such agreements until respect for human rights and international humanitarian law is restored. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for your review of the recommendation. Again, I would encourage people to put their questions, the media, to put their questions in the Q&A, and we move forward. I just wanted to again highlight that this third report, which is quite lengthy and very in-depth, requires reading. Our presenters have given us a thumbnail sketch of the work that's in there, and many people and many hours of work have gone into it and highlighted significant and important findings that are key for the international community to understand and take action on. So the first, I do have a question in the Q&A at the moment from Philip Fernandez. I'm going to read the question. I appreciate the thorough job done by the investigators in this important report. My question is, how is the US supporting the Duterte regime, and how does the report address this issue? Just recently, the US State Secretary Blinken thanked the Duterte regime for extending the status of force agreement. The increased militarization of the Philippines and the important importation of US military hardware and weapons surely is directly connected to the increased terror, violation of the people's rights, and the ongoing violence. The US total domination of the Philippines for the last 100 years seems to suggest that the Duterte is taking direction from the US because the US wants to see the island in its geopolitical challenge to China. Any comment? So maybe Jeannie or Suzanne or anybody would like to, one of you would like to address that question.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
I can begin. So first, I mean, to comment on the reports, right? So the reports, really what they do is kind of bring attention to the widespread and egregious violations of international, human rights mechanisms and international humanitarian law, and then speaks to what are the obligations of the international community and the obligations of states to act to ensure that state violence is stopped, right? And to the extent that addresses, the United States is one of the main allies of the Philippines, but it addresses, I think, all states in terms of military cooperation and training and support of the Philippines government. Now, yes, there is a unique relationship between the United States as a former sort of colonial power, and some would argue a current colonial power in a subversive way in the Philippines as well. And I think that there has been, some traction in U.S. communities of those who support human rights, and including members of Congress who are recognizing that what's happening in the Philippines is dire and that action has to be taken. So there is hope that the United States can change their policy. However, the counterpoint to that is exactly what was written in this, is that the US has an interest in the Philippines. It has an interest in many places in the world. And that interest in the Philippines is directly related to their interest in China. And that, and recently there has been a rise and an increase in aggression, at least rhetorically, against China. And that sort of is connected to US military power and US economic power. So so in the way that these kinds of policies are dealt with in the United States, there is a lot of public discussion saying, absolutely, these human rights violations need to be dealt with, need to be stopped. We need to do what we can. And there's a lot of backroom conversations also saying, well, we have interests in this place, so we need to figure out what we can do and what we cannot do. And I think that also one of the concerns that we also have is that those backroom conversations are not conversations that we human rights advocates or community advocates are privy to either. Like, we don't actually know the extent to which there is security and cooperation between the US government and the Philippines government. We know that it exists, right? But we think that it's much deeper than what is being shown to us, and that's something that we would like to know more of.
Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, go ahead,
just
Jeannie.
add that this report is aimed at the international community as well as the Philippine government. And the international community has certain mechanisms that, in fact, Suzanne talked about in the recommendations. And we don't intend to issue this report and then go away. Our organization and all of our organizations are going to continue on to work together to ensure that the spotlight is shown brightly on these violations. And the fact that the criminal court has taken this up, the fact that this report is aimed at the Human Rights Council, which is meeting this next week. These are things that are very important because no matter what, Duterte regime in the Philippines is part of the world community. And we do have to recognize that they can be subject to pressure and shaming and embarrassment, and that these mechanisms, and certainly to the extent the ICC moves forward, some accountability for the extrajudicial killing and murder.
Thank you, Jeannie. There's a couple of other really good questions here that I'd like to get to. One is from Adonis. I hope I'm pronouncing these names correctly, and I do apologize if I'm not. It's not my strength in names. I always get them wrong. What happens next? How can these reports help hold Duterte accountable to all the human rights abuses? Susan Henry Crow, do you want to take that question on?
I want to speak to part of it. In addition to what my colleagues had said about the international community's responsibility as it relates to human rights, I want to add that it's also our responsibility as NGOs and church communities to monitor the activity of corporations. It's been very serious, the land grabs, particularly in the Lamad and other communities. And where we have churches and people of faith and communities of faith, it's very important for us to pay attention to what the corporation and the international community, not just on human rights, but on economic development, is being hampered by those groups. And so that is something that we will be monitoring along with our other faith partners to those areas in the Philippines that have suffered terribly from encroachment by corporations. So that was one thing that I wanted to add about what is done next. Also, many faith groups are speaking out on these extreme human rights violations in the Philippines and the relationship of the United States and other world communities in either supporting the elimination of human rights or paying attention to the abuses of human rights.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to add to that question? Derek?
I'd like to, if I can, elaborate a little bit in terms of follow-up and next steps. It's very important for those of us in our respective countries that we represent to engage our government leaders in a manner that highlights these reports' findings and uses the mechanisms that they have on hand. And this is, of course, very key for the United States to make known the concerns of civil society groups, of churches, of legal and other guilds, to say that we're paying attention and that we're aware of the relationship that the U.S. has with the Philippines in a way that's been negative and has a potential to be to make a positive difference. One of the central mechanisms now that's on the table is the Philippine Human Rights Act, and the third report makes specific mention of this as something that the U.S. government should take account of, that we have obligations, that is the US government has obligations to ensure that recipients of foreign aid and military aid hold to standards of human rights accountability, of protecting human rights, and we don't always do that in many instances, and certainly in the Philippines, it's been a case where our State Department and our military have too often looked away, for expediency, and feel like the American public is not paying attention. And indeed, in many cases, in many ways, we're not. So by simply lifting up this report, lifting up the particulars of the concerns, and saying that we are aware of what's going on in the Philippines, and that we're aware of the history and the ongoing complicity of the United States government in these human rights violations and in the outright violence against the people, and that the United States needs to do a better job of holding its ally accountable for use of its military aid, and not to take advantage of it for its, as noted, the geopolitical interests, whether that's in the war on terror or in its China containment policy.
Thank you, Derek. And I think that's really important, particularly from the Canadian perspective, how we are complicit in some of the actions, which leads me to the next question from Cheryl McMara. How does the extractive sector activities by Western companies impact the human rights situation in the Philippines? Who would like to take that question on?
I can start. The extractive industries are some of the most predatory in the world. They think oil is somewhere. They think gold is somewhere. They think something they need is somewhere. They want to go take it, and they don't necessarily want to provide compensation or provide any kind of go through any legal proceedings to try to buy or get land or rights to it. So there is this, and in fact, there's a lot of corruption, I'm sure, that's involved in many of these highly profitable resource extraction, mining, and other kinds of operations. Obviously, the country does have a right to control its own resources, but they don't have a right to take them from the owners of the land who have the land, or who have been living on the land, or whose ancestral lands they are, just to take it. And in fact, if it is, most of these companies that do this are multinational in nature, and mining operations, and they are not the same as the country. They are multinational corporations that are extracting wealth mainly for themselves and not for the people of the Philippines. So it's a whole other subject, but extractive industries are some of the worst predatory land grabbing, environment spoiling industries in the world, and most of them, if not all, are multinational that take the benefits and leave the disaster behind. They take the private property and try to socialize the damage among the people left behind.
Thank you, Jeannie. For sure, we heard that in the stories of the Lumad people in the Mindanao area in the southern part of the Philippines, and it's happening in the north in the Cordillera as well, where the indigenous people are forced off their land by mining companies so they can do their business, and that wealth from those mining companies does not find its way back to the community. In fact, it leaves the environmental situation in a horrific state. Yeah, right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, those are two examples, but it's happening all over.
Yeah, those are just two examples. Yeah. Derek, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, this of course, runs right up against the infringement on the right to development of the Filipino people. Of course, the predatory nature of extractive industries fits hand in glove with a socio-political structure like in the Philippines, where there's such great wealth inequality. There's a lack of of concern for the land reform that's supposed to be in place, and a rather feudal system of worker exploitation and elite land ownership, so that that companies benefit from the propensity of landowners and governments to see that resources and profits are funneled to owners rather than to the workers of the land and to the farmers. Very much related to this issue is that of the violence against environmentalists and the total disregard for environmental rights. But much of the violence has been committed against environmentalists, environmental protectors. A report just today pointing out that this has been the deadliest year for environmental protectors around the world, many of whom are indigenous communities or advocates of indigenous rights, who are disenfranchised of their land and of their natural right to resources of the land. And those who speak up for indigenous communities, for environmental rights, and for the protection of the people to benefit from from the fruit of the land, are intentionally targeted in the Philippines. And this is clearly documented in order to protect the interests of landowners and of corporations that are taking the profits out of the Philippines.
Right, thank you, Derek. We're coming to the end of our time, and there's one more question here I think we'd like to address, although there's several other questions, but I think we're running out of time. But I'd like to put this question forward from Jojo. What is the current situation of the LGBTQIA human rights activities in the Philippines? Do you have statistics about arrests, deaths, and red tagging and other atrocities that members of this community are still experiencing up to this time? Who of the panels would like to address that question? Susan, would you like to pick that up? Suzanne?
I don't have an answer to the question of statistics. I'm wondering if any of my colleagues do. Susan, yeah.
That was one of the areas that was not explored specifically. The testimonies that came to us, we would not say how it directly impacted the LGBTQ community. So that was not one of the areas that we specifically explored, but we're aware of some things that sometimes were spoken and sometimes unspoken. And it would be an area that we would be sensitive to, even though it was not explicitly, we didn't have specific testimony explicitly about that. I think that, I can't speak for my colleagues, but I think it would be an area that we would continue to look at. And as we go forward in the work that we continue to do, I saw the last question, that we will not only work with government agencies and civil society and faith communities in our own communities, examining the potential violations that we have ignored, as well as promoting civil and human rights, both in the Philippines and in the international community. And the LGBT community would certainly be part of that.
Great, thank you. In light of our time, we're at almost an hour, we're almost 55 minutes into this launch. And so I would just invite our presenters just for the 1 or 2 sentences, anything they'd like to wrap up with. And maybe we could begin with Jeannie Mayer, if you have just a sentence or 2 of thought as we come to the end of our presentation this afternoon.
Thank you, Patricia. I just want to disclose that I've actually had an interest in the Philippines and Philippine history for many, many years. I did my undergraduate thesis on the war in the Philippines. I intend to follow up and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers will continue to follow up to press the rights of the Filipino peoples that have been the violations of the rights of the Filipino peoples that have been exposed in this report. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Derek, do you have a couple sentences you'd like
Sure.
to conclude with?
I just wanted to point out, I dropped a link to a Human Rights Watch report from 2020 on the rights of LGBTQI individuals in the Philippines. And in particular, the suppression of dissent or of public protests that's been enabled during this pandemic period. And I would just use that as sort of like the one overarching takeaway is that this pandemic has provided many societies an opportunity to reflect upon the rights and status of people and what they deserve from their government in many respects. And in many cases, such as the Philippines, it's been too easily used as an opportunity to exploit the people and to deny them basic services in terms of healthcare, food, social protections, and rather to prosecute policies that advance specific political agendas. And so, I would just call upon the government. People ordinarily have a right to petition and even protest the government when policies don't protect them and ensure their rights. But especially during this pandemic period, governments have an extra obligation to protect basic needs of their people, and that has been abused by the Duterte administration during the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Derek. Susanna, do you have something a couple sentences you'd like to conclude with?
Yes, I just want to thank the person who raised the last question about the LGBT community. I think, as Susan said, that's something that is important to look at. And what we've seen in kind of other examples of heightened state violence, that very often misogyny and homophobia are used to fuel kind of sort of the underlying oppression that's happening. And I mean, other than that, I mean, what I would like to say is that the National Lawyers Guild in the United States continues to be committed to working in solidarity with the human rights movement in the Philippines. And that includes being part of the fight to pass the Philippines Human Rights Act, as well as other projects. And we see it not merely because it's an egregious case of human rights violations. It's really concerning how the killing of poor people can be so normalized, right? And without any kind of internal or international accountability, because that is leading the world as a whole in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Suzanne. Susan Henry Crow, do you have a few words?
Just briefly, I want to say that it's been such an honor both to be with our colleagues together, and also what amazing people that we've met. The witnesses have been so incredibly brave and courageous, and their stories are profoundly affecting. And so there's been a lot of sorrow for us in hearing the stories and a lot of poignancy. But I'm most of all so amazed at the resiliency and the courage and the bravery of people who have lived in very difficult situations. And so it's an honor to be part of that journey. And as Jeannie said, we all have affections for the people in the communities, and that will last a long time. And we intend to stay in solidarity with the Philippine people.
Thank you all very much. It's great to hear your words and your reflections and the energy and time you've put into this. I think the call of the three reports, one of the underlying and basic call, as you've all mentioned and said, is that it is important to keep these issues in front of on the world stage, that we can push our respective countries to take action, support the UN and force the UN to take more strategic action on human rights issues, realizing that the Philippines is one country where we're experiencing this, but that we are experiencing this kind of human rights violations in many other places in the world. And so that these are key times to lift this up, particularly during this pandemic, which has shown the colors of many countries that are not there to support their peoples. And Duterte is certainly representative of a government that has not kept its people out of harm's way. And it has failed its people in providing basic human rights to all of the Filipino people. So thank you all again. I'd just like to take the moment now as we sum up here and close to say thank you. There are many people that worked on these reports. I would like to thank the commissioners, the high commissioners, the sub-commissioners, the media workers, the Philippine partners, the witnesses, the collaborators team, the writing team, the communications team, the tech team, and Investigateph coordinators that have made the launch today and enabled the entire 3 reports to be reproduced in these 8 months. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup. Salamat. And the other piece I just want to say before we sign off is that all of this is done mostly, 95% of this work is volunteer. And so there's a lot of time and commitment across the world that have put these reports together. And these are key and important reports to keep in front of us and to use as our guide as we move forward, seeking justice and human rights. Thank you.